Despite some very positive reviews, a couple of books that will strongly influence the direction of Doctor Who for the next 20 years or more, and the introduction of many writers who go on to become hugely important to the franchise, the early Virgin New Adventures were still a spotty range, wildly inconsistent in tone, continuity and quality. And so in stepped the range's editor to write a book that attempted to consolidate some of the wilder elements and influence the direction of the series going forward. Could he manage to do this at the same time as writing an excellent, noteworthy standalone novel? No. Welcome back to the Library of St John the Beheaded, a history of Doctor Who in prose, and this time we'll be taking a look at Deceit by Peter Darvill-Evans. Despite some encouragement from other writers to let her go entirely, Darvill-Evans always planned to merely give Ace a break and chance to grow up after her departure in Love and War. Sadly, this being a 1993 new adventure, grow up doesn't mean the same thing as mature. Yes, this is the first story starring the character who would go on to be called New Ace. New Ace has never been popular, with readers or authors. While the original idea behind her departure was that an adult science fiction book range shouldn't really star a teenage girl whose harshest insult was toe rag, the replacement we got wasn't really any better. New Ace has become a synonym for angst, whining, and in many ways immaturity in a way that comes across far worse than that seen in the younger incarnation of the character. This book didn't review well, and one of the major concerns was that bringing Ace back so soon would majorly stunt the development of Bernice's character, one which had been barely given any chance to stretch her legs at this point. There's some truth to this, but thankfully it didn't turn out anywhere near as bad as many feared in the long run. If anything, the general unlikableness of New Ace only helped Benny to shine in contrast. Having a grounded, mature and likeable character like Bernice was the perfect antidote to the gun-toting, hissy-fit-having Dorothy McShane Sr. Virgin employee and future range editor Bex Levine never liked the character, saying she never worked, it was awful, I couldn't wait to get rid of her. Ben Aronovich, who had captured Ace so well on screen, was disappointed with the new version too, saying Ace was wildly inconsistent from book to book, and I never got to write for her, so I never got to fix it. One of the notable things about New Ace is her outfit. Gone are the leather jacket and leggings of the rebellious 80s teen, replaced by a black rubber catsuit. This came about because the TV show's effects designer, Mike Tucker, suggested she'd look good in one. Tucker had also begun to write scripts for the show as it came to an end, one of which will turn up as a novel many years from now, and was friends with Sophie Aldred, even writing a book about Ace with her, famously including photos of the real-life catsuit. So hopefully this wasn't intended to be quite as pervy as it might be read. But it's still a bit unnecessary, really. In the 3 years since her departure, Ace has hardened, joining the military, really? And I guess views quickly went out the window then, and taking up arms in the Dalek War. Along with her catsuit, she wears a voice-activated dart gun strapped to her forearm, carries various explosives, and has an electrified baseball bat. You can see how this was intended to be an expansion of the character, famous for developing Nitro 9 and beating a Dalek to death with a similar bat, but it also feels like a betrayal of the anti-authoritarian character brilliantly developed by Ian Briggs and Andrew Cartmel a few years before. After all, she's angsty, angry, macho, and about as appealing and charming a character as one of the anonymous soldiers and mercenaries scattered throughout the Eric Saywood era of the TV show. I think there's at least an attempt to make her into something resembling a strong female character, but that's something that's already been done better with Benny. There was, and still is to an extent, a pattern of men trying to make strong female characters by simply making them like men, which can work. Honor Blackman arguably became the first powerful leading lady on TV when playing Kathy Gale in The Avengers, at least partially because the character was never rewritten after initial scripts were created for a male character. But that's very different to what Darvill-Evans does for New Ace. Here he makes her the worst kind of man, an unlikable, immature, aggressive, macho stereotype. Feels like a 15-year-old boy's idea of what a cool character would be. The book is dedicated to Ace's creator and actor, Ian Briggs and Sophie Aldred. Darvill-Evans even says thanks, and I hope you still like her, so there was definitely some self-awareness there. Other than introducing new Ace, the other purpose of Deceit was to provide a stable, settled backdrop for the book series going forward after a shaky start. You need to create a setting that is both consistent and believable, said the author of the 25th and 26th centuries portrayed in the Future History cycle of books, the loose run of stories released between Love and War and Lucifer Rising. The kind of stipulations he gave to writers this era and the new adventures going forward are discussed in the afterword at the back of the book, along with the editor's response to some fan questions, including stating that there are no plans to feature past Doctors in the new adventures, and he's not very keen on doing books starring them at all, potential missing adventures, but hasn't written the idea off completely, noting there is some fan interest. But his main drive is to keep things moving forward, to continue from the story of the TV show rather than simply keep the franchise popped up with fan service. Which I respect. I actually majorly respect that. But I'm not a big fan of looking backwards. I think it mostly results in uninspiring and unimaginative rubbish, as well as being a sign of creative stagnation. And although some great stories were published in those lines, I don't think the missing and past Doctor Adventures books are especially exciting or notable overall. It's the one reason I do worry about the state of Doctor Who at the moment. We promised it's not going away, but we were also promised the same in 1989, and look what happened then. But without an incumbent Doctor, we won't have the option for an equivalent of the New Adventures, or the 8th Doctor Adventures, or the Big Finish 8th Doctor stories. Without any idea what's going to happen next, Doctor Who can't actually move forward, even in terms of expanded universe stuff. And moving forwards is the one thing that's kept it going for 62 years. Anyway, among the rules set out for the New Adventures universe are that there's only one main universe. That's a contentious rule, but Doctor Who flips and flops and can never really decide on how alternate realities, dimensions, universes and timelines really work. That the past cannot be altered, and that the Doctor's time on Gallifrey is a long, long time ago in Earth's past. There's acknowledgement that some TV stories contradict these ideas, but they mostly support them. Darvill-Evans considers the book competent at best, and provided a benchmark below which we weren't allowed to go, which is at least refreshingly self-aware and mostly accurate. We still get a couple more books which are arguably worse than this though. But most of all, it was a test for the editor to see if he could make a book using his own guidelines, so as not to make them too restrictive to future authors. And, that seems like a pretty good idea. It's also the longest New Adventure to date, the first to run more than 300 pages. The prologue is good. Opens with mystery and intrigue. A character called Bertrand, uses a neural link to talk to someone or something about the human Dalek war, which it seems is only happening for the benefit of some higher powers. Why they have staged this intergalactic conflict remains to be seen, and I'll be honest, it's never really fully explained, but there we go. But it's a brilliant teaser that suggests the events of this book will have consequences. Again, yeah. In some ways, not having rights for the Daleks really helped the Virgin New Adventures, them becoming a threatening presence throughout the series, but never seen, unlike, for example, in Big Finish, where they pop up left, right and centre. The upheaval and devastation caused by the Dalek Wars form a backdrop to so many of the stories that we get a sense of just how much destruction they're capable of in a way which we never actually see in the classic series. The New Adventures have a reputation for being edgy, for having the same immature idea of what stories aimed at adults are as Torchwood. Like teenagers, the writers throw in loads of crude sex and violence because they've been let loose after the straitjacket of a series that needed to be family friendly. No matter the will of the individual writers, the overall tone of a series is defined by those who shape it, in this case the editor. And Peter Darvill-Evans here proves this by often being the edgiest of them all. The first character we meet in the main book is a woman. She stands in a room, naked, and is described as young, slim and lithe. Next up, a man called Kelescu is watching a hologram of a woman called Troheim. He thinks she's crossing her legs just so she can show them off. So yes, Peter Darvill-Evans was probably horny the whole time he was writing Deceit. His female characters are frequently portrayed as sexual interest first and people second. The Pit had a group of police informant androids, fairly broadly written but with still hints of macho-ness to them. In that video I said it's something we'd see a lot more of, and that really starts here. A military commander is deploying troops. The irregular auxiliaries, marines so violent they'll turn on each other if not given Daleks to slaughter, for a mission to the planet Arcadia. Yeah, that's nothing to do with the fall of Arcadia from the Time War. Anyway, guess who's going to end up among this bunch of deranged soldiers? Alongside Ace and the other Orcsies, there's something else on the ship. Heavily hinted at being an individual in suspended animation, sometimes referred to as a weapon. They're off to Arcadia to retrieve Dixon from under the noses of the Spinwood Corporation and hopefully leave a big dent in Spinwood while they're at it. Darvill-Evans writes pretty well for all his flaws. Not Paul Cornell level of hanging off every word, but his prose is never boring nor pretentious. Early on we get a scene of a scribe in a monastery library, which is filmed with entertaining detail. His thoughts, the way his footsteps match the ringing of a bell. In just a couple of pages one gets a good idea of the scribe's character and enjoys getting there. He's likeable and witty, with the simple desire of passing through his life experiencing as little dangerous intrigue as possible. The reader sympathises with him when a counsellor attempts to get him promoted. From the hands of many other writers, this would have been and gone in a paragraph or two. Darvill-Evans instead gives him depth and purpose over a few pages. This kind of writing is present throughout the book, giving the impression that the author is very much enjoying the work of writing. At this point, the link between our monastic friend and the military ops plot isn't made clear. Arcadia is described as a corporate planet. There's no mention of an ancient feudal world yet. The neural link suggests somewhere of high technology, and we've not even seen the Doctor and Benny yet. This adds a lot more intrigue to keep the book from seeming too macho and militaristic. And then the reveal. This is Arcadia. The planet has somehow avoided the Dalek War, advances in technology have passed them by, Earth politics is seemingly forgotten, and now a ship full of sadistic Dalek killers is on its way to destroy it. Lovely stuff. Scribe Francis is being sent to Landfall, a place a lot of apprentices don't return from. His conversation with his lover, Lady Christina, discussing this reveals that people on Arcadia die young, usually in their 30s, and that harvests are failing and coming later each year. Anyway, Ace is back, and she's immediately being sexually objectified. Reynold Yesti calls her doll and goes into detailed thoughts about her wide mouth and full lips, and what they could get up to. When she giggles to herself, she's made a plan to get one over on the creep, he thinks she might be on drugs, which he sees as all the better, because it'll make her easier. I mean, don't get me wrong, he's portrayed as an awful person, but is this all really necessary? Anyway, she's older and wiser and crueler and seduces the guy only to inject him with anaesthetic and steal his subdermal ID, cutting it out with a knife, so she can go to Arcadia and kill Daleks. Or so she thinks, as of course there are no Daleks in this book. The book's split into 6 parts, broadly aping classic TV 6-part stories. It's not until part 2 that we finally meet our main characters. Benny, having repeatedly beat the Doctor in chess in the pit, have now seemingly moved on to 4-dimensional chess with pieces that can move temporally as well as spatially. And she's beating him again. All is clearly not well. And this is where the retcons start. One of Darvill-Evans' reasons for writing Deceit was to bring together some of the loose strands that have begun to get a bit frayed. Other than the Time Worm and Cat's Cradle concepts, given to authors and broadly left to be used as well, or indeed as badly, as they liked, the editor had provided very little oversight or aim to the direction of the new adventures so far. And so you had books that were subtly contradicting each other, character beats that didn't quite add to a coherent development, and the tonal consistency of an eclectic music collection thrown on shuffle. So, with his new internal document outlining the themes and limitations that should be broadly written within, Darvill-Evans set about trying to bring past books in line. The Doctor has been behaving oddly for a few books now. Part of this is down to some very weird books being written, I'm thinking Transit and The Pit in particular, and part probably comes from the editor adding in little moments to emphasise this idea, knowing he's going to be tying it up. Apparently, for instance, Ace told Benny one of the reasons she left the TARDIS was because things were getting well weird aboard. Which is news to me. By now the Doctor seems so distracted that he's barely talking to Benny. She wonders whether the destruction of the 7 planets has affected him, because what we really need is another reminder of the pit. The TARDIS's internal geography is reconfiguring regularly, to the extent that Benny frequently finds herself lost. She's close to losing her patience. As she leaves her bedroom, she finds herself in a blank corridor leading nowhere. One by one, as doors turn to walls, the ship begins to close in on her. something is seriously amiss. Intrigue can be good. It's been good up to this point. But it can also irritate, once again, as in the pit. Mystery upon mystery is something I've complained about in earlier videos, and there are bits of Deceit which bug me in the same way. The text begins to be interspersed with fragmented internal dialogue from an unidentified character repeating the phrase, "he cut a hole," alongside other indecipherable sentences. There's enough going on in the plot already, let's leave the mysterious hints at something inexplicable for now, shall we? Given how continuity heavy most of the books have been so far, Deceit is somewhat low on it. There's a passing reference to cyber wars, and of course elements of the main story itself are built on Who history. There's a brief memory of Castrovalva, but by this point we're finally past the point of having past Doctor cameos in every book and TV story references every chapter. Perhaps unsurprisingly, there's more in the way of New Adventures continuity here. The Spinwood Corporation formed as the EB Corporation. EB standing for Eurogen Butler, a merger between genetics business Eurogen and the Butler Institute, the latter of course being the main villains of Andrew Cartmel's Warhead. Darvill-Evans was keen on developing the New Adventures universe, and this is a great example of that. Similarly, the IMC, who first appeared in the third Doctor story, Colony in Space, are expanded upon here, not for the last time in the book series. The Pertwee era casts a long shadow over the early New Adventures. It was arguably the most dystopian period of classic Who, maybe alongside the McCoy run. I use the word in contrast with nihilistic, which is how I describe the Eric Saywood era. With politically and environmentally conscious writers and the counterculture anger of the late 60s still in the air, the early 70s stories tackled social issues in a very upfront manner, and so it's perhaps unsurprising that a lot of their lore found its way into the early 90s grim-dark, occasionally agitprop world of the early New Adventures. The planet Arcadia is advertised as a place to go to start afresh with a simple life away from machines, which channels the themes and settings of several stories of the era, A Colony in Space again, Invasion of the Dinosaurs. But while the stories reach optimistic endings, here we have nothing of the sort. Arcadia's destiny lay in corporate takeover, becoming a Spinwood Corporation factory planet. He cut a hole. Far above Arcadia orbits a Spinwood Corporation space station, in which a worker meets Lacuna, the heart of the operation, hooked up to a computer via the link. This is the first we've seen of the link since the prologue. Lacuna sends the worker, Britta, the naked woman who opened the first chapter, into a weird dreamscape of colours and shapes. It's all nicely written, but all pretty odd. Luna describes it as an analogy. Britta concludes, "It's the Spinwood Corporation." Okay. We learn that Ace is infected with a virus in every cell of her body. The Doctor has apparently given it to her, and it protects her against other viruses, illnesses, bacteria, even hangovers. I suppose it makes sense, travelling from planet to planet, time zone to time zone, one is bound to pick up 100 infections, most of them lethal. It's not explained when Ace received this virus, although it's probably when she first boarded the TARDIS. He cut a hole. She offers to trade the secret of this healing virus with the medic aboard the ship, if he'll let her see what, or indeed who, the secret weapon is, the one stored in cryostasis behind a locked door, and it turns out to be Absalom Dark. A one-time knight of the Grand Order of Oberon, Absalom Dark was eventually sentenced to either death or to become a Dalek killer, sent into the worst places to kill, well, Daleks. And so, as the name of his first comic story suggests, he became Absalom Dark, Dalek Killer. The character appeared in a number of Doctor Who magazine comics throughout the 80s and early 90s. Very much an aggressive, macho, killing machine of a man, he nevertheless gave himself the mission of wiping out every Dalek in the galaxy. Although later retconned, his original story ended in the 1989 comic Nemesis of the Daleks, with him sacrificing himself to destroy a Dalek death wheel. And so Ace and comic readers wonder how on earth he's here, alive, on a spaceship. Ace sets his cryopod to defrost early so she can find out. This is the first time the Doctor Who comics have crossed over with what was, at the time, the franchise's primary outlet. It'll happen again in the future, as famous current characters like Frobisher and Beat the Meat work their way into the wider world of Doctor Who, but at the time this was quite an exciting move, and one that seemed to effectively canonise the Doctor Who magazine comics, much as anything can be canonised in Doctor Who. Of course, a character like Dark is perfectly at home in the universe that Peter Darvill-Evans and others were beginning to develop for the New Adventures. Come on, big boy, don't hang about. Let's go and look at this planet we've come to see. Yeah, not sure anyone had Ace flirting with Absalom Dark on their Virgin New Adventures bingo card. He cut a hole. I hope you're finding this as annoying as a listener as I am as a reader. Keeps being brought up. Time for retcon number 2 then. At some point the Doctor has given Ace a tesseract. A tesseract is a 4-dimensional hypercube, the next step up from a square and a cube. Don't try and imagine one, it's not really possible. And it suddenly unfolds. Actually, it's a hypercube of similarly more than 4 dimensions, because each cube that unfolds from a plane unfolds into further cubes, and before she knows it, Ace is surrounded by the thing. In the centre, she sees the Doctor, sat alone in the centre of the TARDIS, his new Zero Room. And when she approaches him and starts to remind him who he is, his response is a, frankly, slightly tedious exposition dump. But then again, when are exposition dumps not tedious? See, it turns out there's a very simple explanation for why the Doctor and TARDIS have been out of sorts since the end of Cat's Cradle Witchmark. The Doctor being especially mopey during the events of Nightshade, him largely ignoring and ultimately betraying Ace in Love and War, and one presumes his increasingly erratic behaviour with Benny in the books since. I actually pointed it out in the review of that book. One single speck of protoplasm was given special attention at the end of Witchmark. It came from one of Giobni's failed experiments. And so, when the TARDIS repaired itself, that one speck infected it, and somehow the Doctor, probably the symbiotic link. I'm pretty sure none of this was intended by any of those books' authors, of course. And then retcon number 3, this is the big one. Ace's departure was all the Doctor's plan. Yep, he was not only using Jan to destroy the Houthi, but it was also his unconscious mind's plan to intentionally alienate Ace and make her leave, just so she could come back via the Tesseract and remind him who he is inside the Zero Room. Now, other than the fact that this is utter gobbledygook and will be doubly so for anyone who hasn't read Love and War, it also completely undermines the ending of that book. It's a well-remembered and oft-praised novel, in quite a large part due to the matter of the Doctor's manipulations going so far that he pushed his companion away. To suddenly undo that with "it was his plan all along" is appallingly disrespectful to Paul Cornell, insulting to the reader, and just completely lacking in any understanding of how drama works. And this is why you should never write plots with the aim of resolving other plots. If you can tie up or build on an earlier storyline as a result of your own story, then great. If one of your aims is to just plug up plot holes, then stop before you started, because it never ever works. Anyway, while the Doctor is busy decontaminating the TARDIS, Ace steps back into her ship and says they'll meet up on Arcadia. He cut a hole. He cut a big hole in the top of her head. Oh, I think I'd rather have not found out now. Britta's first job for Lacuna and the Corporation, and the mysterious Pool, who keeps getting mentioned, is pulling faces. Yep, really? Grimacing, protesting, showing expressions of fear, pain, suffering and anger. If you want to know what that looks like, check the book's cover. These expressions are sculpted into asteroids, effectively as a warning beacon to keep away from Arcadia. Honestly, when I first saw the image, my mind boggled at the kind of surreal situation that could lead to twisted, contorted faces of rock in space. The answer was a bit disappointing. As for why Lacuna seems to enjoy torturing Britta to get these expressions out of her, well, it's in keeping with the aggressive and sadistic tone of the book, I suppose. As the military ship comes into land, Dark falls and lands on Ace's lap. Trying to stand up, he only succeeds in jamming his hand in between her thighs. So, usual New Adventures fare then. A bit later she finds herself on his lap, and mentally surrenders to the fact that they're going to be having sex. Perhaps it wouldn't be too bad. Funny that this new, headstrong individual Ace is suddenly meek and submissive when it comes to sex. Frankly, I feel sorry for De Vries, the commander of the mission, stuck with no Ace and Absalom Dark and the most unpleasantly written sexual tension this side of Torchwood. The single best part of the book is Benny. She served brilliantly here. Indeed, it's the first book since her introduction in Love and War in which she actually feels like Benny. A caustic wit and frustration at the world, continual determination to make the best of an increasingly absurd circumstance, and a background desire to sod it all off and go for a drink, Darvill-Evans captures her perfectly. Frankly, the favourite quotes section at the end of this video could just be 10 minutes of me reading out Benny's lines. She also shows a strong thread of emotion, barely being able to cope when finding an emaciated girl chained up in a dungeon. She cries, but not before releasing the girl and comforting her with a hug and a song. First thing the girl says, of course, is, "He cut a hole." Interestingly, the author doesn't get quite as strong a handle on the Doctor. When he comes out of the TARDIS and starts looking for Benny, Francis, the scribe, observes him muttering to himself in a fairly eccentric way, which isn't really how I've ever pictured the Seventh Doctor. The portrayal comes much closer to the second, with his absent-mindedness and performative clownishness. In what is becoming standard, Benny and the Doctor are immediately separated. I know it happens in the show as well, but I swear the pair of them have only spent a few chapters together in now 3.5 books. Benny heading to a nearby village, the Doctor bumping into Francis and immediately realising something's very wrong here. Amongst all the imported Earth flora and fauna are plants and creatures that are unusual and alien, and Francis finds it impossible to touch them. Even Benny notices that everything's a bit too neat and too clean for a pre-technological, quasi-medieval society. Around the halfway mark, the reader begins to get suspicions. We've already had a big plot point referencing Cat's Cradle Witchmark, a book half set in a fantastical medieval world that turns out to all be a big experiment by a higher power. Surely this isn't going to be just the same? I think you know where that's going. As the Doctor discovers that the counsellors, the highest ranked individuals on Arcadia, are in fact black and purple skinned creatures with rigid heads, he realises he's all to blame for this. Somehow. That comes somewhat out of the blue, so it does feel a little closer to the Season 26 Doctor, whose schemes tended to backfire a little. He refuses to explain beyond some vague comments about him saving the world in the past and not intending it to lead to this. For all the sense Francis can make of it, he might as well have at least explained what past adventure this was, but then the Doctor's always liked to string the audience along with their answers for as long as possible. Finally, it's time for Ace to arrive on Arcadia. The ship she's on is attacked by force fields in the shape of a giant squid. Only she, Absalom Dark, Captain De Vries, and one other Orcsy, Johansson, make it down to the planet, and immediately find themselves in a gunfight, because that's what soldiers do, I suppose. We then get several pages of descriptions of the battle between the survivors and the 10 counsellors. Aiming, shooting, tactics, jumping behind rocks. It's probably the sort of thing that's quite fun on screen, but I've never found it very enthralling on paper. This kind of thing's really, really hard to write, and unfortunately Darvill-Evans isn't quite good enough to really capture any excitement. Johansson dies, as any good red shirt is expected to. De Vries describes him as the first casualty, which is a bit harsh on the entire ship of people who died a few pages earlier. Coincidentally, all of our main characters arrive somewhat simultaneously at Landfall, the planet's original colony base, as if the name hadn't given that away by now clad in stone and designed to look like a castle. Very slowly the pieces of the story begin to come together, which is lucky, as for a long time it's not especially clear what the point of Deceit actually is. By part 5, Lacuna has explained exactly what Pool is. 6 Spinwood researchers, their minds linked, eventually became a Gestalt entity, giving up their bodies. Over time, the minds of hundreds of more employees were added, creating, well, it's one of those strange incorporeal energy-based entities again, with the power to do weird shit like craft asteroids into faces and create giant invisible space squids. And to back up their main processes, basic computations use a web of human grey matter removed from the population of the planet below, hence them cutting a hole in Christina's head. Christina being Scribe Francis's lover and the sister of Elaine, who Benny was imprisoned with. Not an absurd coincidence, but maybe a slight stretch. It's why the colony is still allowed to exist, and why all the people are cool in their 30s. They're being farmed. All in all, a fairly grotesque situation. It's worth noting at this point, other than blame himself for the situation, the Doctor hasn't really done anything. For the great master manipulator that he is, this is once again another book in which he's content to simply be a spectator for the most part. He eventually reveals that by putting a spanner in the works of the Butler Institute's plans, he put them onto a different path, one which led to the creation of the pool, which I suppose kind of makes it his fault, although he's definitely being harsh on himself there. Ace, Dark and De Vries spend an absolute age getting into the space station to meet the others. Traps are set because Lacuna and Pool are psychotic, maybe? I don't know. It all feels like an excuse to pad out part 5 with a lot of fairly unnecessary action, shooting monstrous spider illusions and navigating airlocks and so on. So a fairly faithful recreation of typical TV 6-parters then. Part 6 arrives and we finally get an exploration of what's going on. Pool wants to create a universe, a place of pure thought to exist in. To do this, he'll need to destroy the star system Arcadia is in. Is it possible to create a universe within a universe? It's a bit of a weird question anyway, but I'm not sure that really makes sense. Anyway, the Doctor informs Paul that it will need a black hole in order to create a universe, and isn't capable of something that audacious. He goes through the coding, finding all sorts of weird, twisted imagery that's slowly taking up space in Paul's memory. Giant monstrous creatures, a wall heading off into infinity, human limbs and faces protruding from it. Paul is quite clearly insane. Too much time trapped within itself, with no physical form. It's been going through a kind of sensory deprivation. It's sent it loopy. Sadly, it doesn't want help with its sanity, merely the TARDIS. I mean, something usually wants the TARDIS. In some ways, this isn't a bad thing. It'll stop the faintly ludicrous and hugely destructive plan to create a universe within our universe. Now, I still don't get that at all, but it's not exactly ideal. The Doctor lets Paul have the TARDIS, as he doesn't want another star system's worth of blood on his hands. I mean, given how much chaos a deranged Gestalt in charge of the TARDIS will cause, it seems like he's going to end up with way more blood on his hands this way, but then this is always a Doctor Who thing, isn't it? He's happily to directly save one life, only to indirectly cause the death of millions, because, well, the whole of Doctor Who feels like an enormous, never-ending trolley problem at times, doesn't it? The Doctor always takes the path that leads to the least direct deaths rather than the fewest deaths. Does that make him a coward? Maybe, I don't know. The trolley problem doesn't have any concrete answers. And this isn't so much of an issue in classic Who, where emotional grounding isn't such a key ingredient, but going into the Wilderness years, and especially into the Revival series, it becomes a glaring problem. I feel like most of this stems from Genesis of the Dalek, the famous "Do I have the right" moment, one which firstly posits all the positives to come from the existence of the Daleks, but also leads to the Doctor deciding that, whether he has the right or not, he has to take a drastic step to ultimately set back the tide of evil. The Revival series ties itself in knots over this, the Doctor angrily torturing someone who's out for vengeance for a genocide, yet also forgiving the Master for everything he does at the end of Series 3. It's the kind of moral conundrum you can write about in a standalone novel or movie, but when it's always going to be followed by another evil plan and another universe-ending threat, it becomes a bit hollow and repetitive and hypocritical. Anyway, this is the 7th Doctor, so he's probably got a plan, one which will hopefully lead to no deaths. Meanwhile, Ace accidentally kills Absalom Dark. Seriously, she fires one of her explosive darts at the weird yellow cloud, temporarily representing Paul. At the exact same moment, Dark jumps at it to try and wrestle it to the ground, or I don't know, something. It's a strange death. I appreciate the lack of grand gesture and ultimate sacrifice, the companion accidentally murdering a fundamentally decent man, even if he was a pain in the arse, but the whole setup of Paul taking on a visual presence for that moment makes it feel kind of contrived. But, you know, extra points for not going down the obvious route, even if it means that Dark serves little to no actual purpose in the main story. There's no real time for this to sink in, however, as the Doctor is now crying at losing his TARDIS. It's always weird when you get written portrayals of the 7th Doctor doing something he'd never do in the TV series. McCoy, the absolutely tremendous human being that he is not the most diverse actor. When he works within his range, he's astonishing, but outside of that, he can struggle to convince. So imagining him as the Doctor crying is a genuinely strange concept. Anyway, yes, it does all turn out to be a big trap on the Doctor's part. Paul's attempt to infiltrate the TARDIS is only partly effective, and it ends up in the newly built Zero Room. The Zero Room is, of course, cut off from the rest of the universe, and so it's isolated entirely, unable to grow or make any more destructive plans, or even run the Spinwood Corporation. The Zero Room is ejected into the time vortex. Problem solved. Paul also decides that it wants to get revenge on the Doctor. Don't worry, that's not coming back. The epilogue gives us opportunity to see loose ends being tied up for a change, and for Ace to have a go at the Doctor for not mentioning to her that Absalom Dark was a clone. Yes, there's that mystery tied up with a shrug, and for generally being a hypocrite. But despite all that, it turns out she is staying. Lots more of that kind of moaning coming up in future books. Benny and the Doctor are immediately suspicious. What's she up to? We'll have to wait until next time to find out. The appendix gives us a potted history of the galaxy as written in a fictional history book, the Dalek and Draconian Wars and the aftermath, the rise of corporations and the stranglehold they took as technology improved, they retained the rights to its usage, the seeds of the Earth Empire sown as the colonies began to recover. It's rich and detailed world building and great work from the editor. Clearly this is a strength of his. The technology found in the book is the most prescient yet seen in the series. Computer chips with tiny needles storing data in solid state form, each able to hold a library's worth of information, updated wirelessly. Okay, so it's more 21st century technology than 25th, but it feels a lot less jarring than the floppy disks and anthropomorphic software used in earlier books. Dark wields a chainsword, almost certainly a chainsaw in the shape of a sword, which gives him a bit of an Ash from Evil Dead vibe in my head. Outside of tidying up and expanding on the existing New Adventures lore and the appearance of Absalom Dark, there's not much continuity here. The Master and the Monk get name-checked. Benny remembers the destruction of the 7 planets, something that will stay with her forever. Ironic, given that much of what happened in the pit has left my mind already. The icky attitude towards women does continue away from Ace's portrayal. Britta's one weakness turns out to be jealousy of Ace. She's not as pretty or as clever as Britta, so why is she getting so much of Lucuna's attention? It is a pretty terrible cliche to fall back on. Benny thinks of Britta as a bimbo, simply because she's blonde. Elaine's role in the book seems to be entirely to cry. The Doctor refers to Lacuna as "you silly woman." The writing occasionally trips over itself. Ace is considering her companions on this journey, noting that DeFreeze isn't complicated, and on the following page deciding that Dark differs from DeFreeze because he's uncomplicated. It's the sort of detail that's plagued a lot of the books so far, but actually a rare example in this one. For the most part, the prose is strong and the detail consistent. Given the overall tone of the book, there's not as much swearing as one might expect, but still quite a bit. Ace still has a preference for fairly childish terms like chip sucker, but you'll find cases of arses, bastard, bitch, fuck, and a few cyber shits. Dark says balls. For the most part, each Virgin New Adventure so far has had an internal consistency with its qualities. Bad books have had a multitude of issues, bad writing, characterisation and plot. Some are stodgily written and narratively boring, others inept on every level. Deceit isn't one of these, making it the first book in the range that's difficult to get a really good handle on, because the writing and the structure and the characterisation are all strong here. It begins to suggest that Peter Darvill-Evans is a much better writer than he is editor, but the actual content, the story and ideas are dire. Macho, militaristic, violent posturing, a very unpleasant attitude towards women, and Ace especially, and just a grimdark feel that's totally unsuited to Doctor Who. The only respite is the medieval life in Arcadia, which borrows a lot of its ideas from Witchmark, again down to the fact that that planet is simply being used by a higher power. And of course the main plot is just an extension of earlier book Warhead, with relatively few surprises and a frankly underwhelming climax. Overall, it's a story by an unimaginative teenage boy, presented as the writing of a talented adult author. Or as Paul Cornell puts it, guns, soldiers solving the plot, and the lack of a doctor. As ever, I'll end with a couple of favourite quotes from the book. Corridors are supposed to go somewhere. Bernice stood with her hands on her hips, as if daring anyone to refute her assertion. You're supposed to be long in relation to your width. You're supposed to have a plethora of doors and other corridors leading off you. I look to you for choices, for opportunities, for the possibility of randomness in an otherwise linear existence. Nothing was amiss in the control room. It exuded its usual smug air of calm normality. Don't blame yourself, the Doctor said cheerily, holding the umbrella over both of them. It's very common, particularly in your species. Ignorance is just ignorance. You need knowledge to achieve self-delusion, and more knowledge still for enlightenment. A distant look appeared in his eyes. Sometimes it seems there is never enough knowledge. Deceit ends what is, in my mind, the third season of the Virgin New Adventures, one in which Ace doesn't travel in the TARDIS. It's my least favourite run in the series, partly because the books are still trying to find their own voice. There's still not really been enough time for some of the better earlier entries, notably those by Paul Cornell, to really filter much influence through, so with relatively little editorial direction, it's still a bunch of unconnected authors trying to put their own clashing stamps on Doctor Who. And so it's time to look forward to Season 4, or Season 30, which will mix things up a little, delving somewhat into Earth's past. But before that, we'll have something a little more in line with the past few books, with Lucifer Rising, which sees the arrival of Andy Lane and Jim Mortimer, both of whom will have a big impact on the range in the future. So join me in the next episode of the Library of St. John the Beheaded as we finish the future history cycle with that book. And in the meantime, please do leave me a comment, a like, a subscription, share the video, always really appreciated. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you join me next time.